Everybody. Welcome to the 11th Annual Central Texas Water Conservation Symposium. Advance my slide here. Thank you for joining us for day two. We have a great program today. I put the agenda up here, but you can find it online too at texaslivingwaters.org. Click on the events tab. We're going to get started pretty quick this morning. Today, our speakers are covering reuse, outdoor irrigation, and water loss audits. We have a real jam-packed agenda. Once again, I want to give a shout out to our sponsors. This group of organizations supports the planning and production of the symposium every year, and we appreciate their continued support and really couldn't do it without them. It takes a lot of staff time and all different kinds of efforts by different folks, from outreach to technical guidance. So we really appreciate everybody being involved in this. So let's go ahead and get started because as you can see, we have a lot to do in 2.5 hours. I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Robert Mace is the Executive Director and Chief Policy Officer at the Meadows Center for Water and the Environment at Texas State University. He's a professor of practice of geography and has over 30 years experience in hydrology, hydrogeology, stakeholder processes, and water policy. He was previously Deputy Executive Administrator for Water Science and Conservation at the Texas Water Development Board, where he worked for 17 years. And I'll just say he is a great partner to so many of us that are on the call, on the Zoom meeting today, and always a great resource for all of us. And we really appreciate you always being available and sharing your knowledge. So for Robert's presentation today, he's going to introduce you to reuse, present outcomes of a recent study on regulatory impediments, and discuss what's happening during the legislative session. So I'm going to stop sharing and let Robert take it away.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Jennifer. I love these events. Sure wish that we could be meeting in person just to see everybody, and then also these symposiums really have good food. And so I'm really missing lunch that y'all provide. I'm happy to be here today to talk to you about some work that we've been doing at the Meadows Center with various cooperators. Broadly, it's about implementing One Water in Central Texas and in Texas in general. But what I'm going to talk about today is something very specific related to reuse, which is an important component of One Water. You might be wondering, and Stacy Pandy was asking, why do I have a blueberry pie up there on my background? And great question. When I was putting the presentation together, I always like to have a little background in this is kind of my standard format. And so I got over to Google Images and I typed in purple pipes, and up came this slew of delicious looking blueberry pies. So I was confused because I'm like, wait a minute, I was searching for purple pipes. It also made me maybe hungry because some of these are fabulous, and particularly this one caught my eye, and I was just like, wow, that looks really good. And I'm still confused, and I go look, and I'm like, oh, I misspelled pipes with pies, which is why you're seeing a blueberry pie here. But I was like, gosh, this picture's so beautiful. I wonder how I can integrate it into the presentation. And it occurred to me that the title is "Oh no, I've got regulators in my reuse." This is not a presentation to complain about regulators. We need regulators, and specifically, we're talking about Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, because they are ensuring that whatever we're doing, particularly on the innovative side, protects health and public safety, and so they're a critical role in the discussions of implementing innovative technologies. And thinking about this blueberry pie, those of us that are implementing water reuse, of course, typically that's indicated with a purple pipe. Those of us that are considering using it, And those of us that aren't using it aren't considering, but you very well may be in the future. In fact, I'll be shocked if 10, 20 years from now you aren't. That base of the pie really is, us trying to implement water reuse, or in the active role of implementing water reuse. And then the blueberries are the regulators, which enhance the whole dish, the whole dessert here, the whole goal of what we're going after. And if you look real closely, look at that kind of, I don't know if you over here, let me zoom in. Oh yeah, that does kind of look like Toby Baker. So, indeed, we've got some regulators in our reuse pie. That's a fact of life, and it's okay. It helps make the pie better. So let's talk about different flavors of reuse. And whether you like it or not, there is, you're drinking reused water most likely. Unless you're getting your water from a deep groundwater well. But even that water probably at some point passed through some critter and then got recycled through nature. But there's something called de facto reuse, so which is basically a fancy term for unplanned reuse. Traditionally, folks that pull water out of the river treat it to drinking water standards, run it through their system, treat it in their wastewater system, and then put it back in the river. Some cases, say for example, San Antonio, where they're pumping groundwater, they pull that out, splash it with some chlorine, run it through their system, treat it, and then put it into the San Antonio River. And then it flows downstream, and then somebody else is pulling water out of the river. And so that is reuse, but it's just de facto and it's unplanned. And there's actually quite a bit of that going on in Texas. The story is half the flow in the Trinity River is treated wastewater from the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, and that heads on down to Houston. If you plan to use, if you're actually actively planning and doing it, and you have an environmental buffer. An environmental buffer is like you're putting in a lake or you're putting in the river, like I just described. In some cases, it's put into the aquifer. El Paso does that. That's called indirect reuse. And so there's some, it's touching the environment. The water, treated wastewater, is touching the environment in some way, shape, or form. Then there's direct reuse. And this is planned reuse without an environmental buffer. And so that's the purple pipes you see, say downtown at the parks. So that's treated wastewater pumped through purple pipes and then used for irrigation. And there's sub-flavors of reuse. There's potable and non-potable reuse. So purple pipe is non-potable reuse, but you can also do indirect reuse and indirect reuse as potable. And so there's pipe to pipe direct reuse, potable direct use, and then also direct to distribution. And we'll talk a little bit more about that coming up, because part of what I'm going to talk about is related to that. Reuse in Texas has been growing as our population grows, as our water resources become harder to access. It's like I like to say, a lot of the easy water is gone in Texas, and so we're having to be more creative about finding new supplies. And so this is showing from 2000 up through 2018. Estimates of reuse in Texas, and those last three dots I kind of added to this older figure since there's new information. So it is growing. I don't know what that lull is between 2013 and 2015, but in general, we are seeing increase use of reuse across the state as people see the value in using this water resource. I know there's a lot of smaller water utilities in the audience, and you might be thinking, well, that's for the big boys and girls to do reuse, but municipal reuse is used across the state. Now, some of these counties are urban, Harris, Travis, Bear, but there's also a lot of rural counties out here of communities using reuse. And even in the wetter eastern half of the state, you do notice a number of rural counties in the western half of the state that are rural, that are using reuse. And of course, the drier it is, there tends to be a greater need to be creative with your water supplies. So this is not just a tool for big utilities. There's a lot of small utilities that are doing it and are planning to do it for the future. This is a summary for each of the water plans since 2002, showing existing supplies of reuse. So in other words, what is the current ability to provide reuse or treated wastewater for reuse, and then what is planned for future strategies. Need to stress that this is all comparing the same decade, 2050. So, the more recent water plans actually go out to 2070, but in order to compare the same decade, I just pulled out the 2050 data. And it's, the data is a little messy, but I'm trying to show here is that, there is a general increase, not only in existing supplies, but also in the plans. 2007, my sense was that number was a little wonky. And so I think the planned reuse in that particular water plan is lower than what it's shown. And then in the lower right-hand corner, I took a peek at the draft 2022 state water plan, which is now posted at the Water Development Board's website for review and comment. In 2050, projecting about 700,000 of existing supplies, which is a little higher than 2017 in the 2017 plan, and about 850,000 acre feet per year of new supplies. So little about the same for 2050 as in the 2017 plan. So there are plans for more and more communities, as well as more volume of reuse supplies going forward. In fact, a more than doubling going forward. And that's not surprising. I like to tell folks that your local wastewater treatment plant, it's like your local spring, and that's a source of water that you have, and generally own that water, and that water could be used versus building a pipeline off somewhere else to either bring in surface water or bring in groundwater, and it can be very cost effective. I'm proud of my Photoshop work on this. I did this, if you're wondering. But direct potable reuse is becoming a bigger and bigger thing in Texas. The first place this was done in the world was in Namibia, Africa, back in the 80s. And then for a long time, nobody else was doing this. And just a reminder, direct potable reuse is just taking your local spring of your wastewater treatment plant and treating that water to drinking water standards and putting it back into your distribution system in a pipe-to-pipe type approach. There's no environmental buffer. The Colorado Municipal Water District built the world's second direct potable reuse plant out at Big Spring. And so what happens there is they take the treated wastewater from their standard wastewater treatment plant, which before they built their direct potable reuse plant, they just discharged that water into a creek nearby. Instead of discharging into the creek, they're putting it into a kind of a reclamation polishing plant where it goes through a high level of treatment, including reverse osmosis. Now in their particular system, they then, through pipes, put that water in a pipe that then gets combined in the pipe with raw water from the reservoir that then goes to a traditional surface water treatment plant. But because there's no environmental buffer, it's considered direct potable reuse. And that project's been very successful, gotten a lot of attention. It was also the springboard for Wichita Falls to do an emergency direct potable reuse plant during the last major drought that we had. Wichita Falls was weeks to months away from completely running out of water. They were fortunate they already had a desalination plant there. Their surface water is so salty that they have a desal plant in good times. But once their lakes got so low, they then repurposed that desalination plant to do direct potable reuse. And then similar to the Big Spring project, it's kind of a pipe-to-pipe mix, conventional surface water treatment out to the public. That was temporary. It's since been shut down, but also evidence of that technology. And then El Paso right now is seeking to build a direct potable reuse plant, and they call it the direct to distribution. And so instead of mixing the treated, hyperly treated wastewater and mixing it with raw water, they're treating the wastewater, and then after some mixing, because you don't want to put RO water into a municipal water system, they then put it directly into they're planning to put it directly into their distribution system. And so you'll hear them say that they're the first plant of its type in the United States, which is accurate, and really would be only the fourth direct potable reuse plant in the world, and would only be the third operational one. Those are, for the most part, big dogs doing direct potable reuse, but the state water plan, and I haven't checked the 2022, but the 2017 state water plan has about 36 smaller communities looking to do direct potable reuse. There's a lot of communities down in Lower Rio Grande Valley, as well as smaller communities in West Texas looking to do direct potable reuse to help meet their future water supplies. Again, it's a water supply that's already there. It's local, and so that I think that becomes pretty enticing. What about Central Texas? Well, there actually is a project in Central Texas, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So kind of the big reason I wanted to give this presentation was to talk about some of the conclusions from this report, which was looking at regulatory impediments to implementing One Water in Texas. This is co-authored with Vanessa Puig-Williams, and she's the lead author, and really did a fantastic job. This was work funded by the Cynthia and George Mitchell Foundation, and it's available at the Meadow Center's webpage. And this was a broad look at alternative water supplies and what is preventing their use on the regulatory side in Texas. So it's a policy analysis, as well as comparing, what other states have done. And part of what we looked at was implementation of reuse in the state. Conclusions from this report is, one is Texas is very accommodating on innovative reuse of water, and really just innovative use of water. Texas Commission on Environmental Quality and the legislature have been very agreeable to working with communities to get these projects happening. So, Texas has the first engineered wetlands to lake reuse project up in Dallas-Fort Worth. There's a couple of those projects, and then as well as the first direct potable reuse plant in the United States. And that's saying something. That is not a trivial thing to happen. Broadly, though, there's still some issues out there. The regulations that exist were pretty much based on an old model of conventional water supplies, of water wells and pulling waters out of a river or out of a reservoir. And that's true at the federal level. But then that, of course, then trickles down to the state level. And so we have to get inventive to either work around those or look for ways to change those regulations. And one of the conclusions on reuse was that we saw that there was a need for clear regulatory and permitting paths for direct potable reuse. Given that there's 36 small communities, and I think there'll be more in the future, they don't quite have the finances to necessarily navigate the permitting path at the state. And so the thought there was that if there was a guidance document or some sort of document that made it real clear on what a community needs to do in order to line themselves up to do direct potable reuse, that would be a very important thing. And then we also identified a need to change state rules for on-site wastewater treatment. The issue there is that if you want to treat wastewater on site and then reuse it, you need to also have a permit with the state to dispose of that water if you can't use it, if you can't reuse it. And so you either have to have the ability to do a land application with that water, or you have to hold a permit to discharge it to a surface water body. And given that there's in the urban setting, more and more folks are looking to do on-site wastewater treatment, it's not realistic to expect a property owner to, one, they're not going to have the space to do land application, and two, they're not going to build a pipeline in order to do disposal to the Colorado River, in case they need that. And the thought is that, because those entities are in an urban setting, they should be able to piggyback on Austin's, for example, existing wastewater permits in order to be able to do on-site wastewater treatment. And their emergency outlet then is the city sewer at that point. This is a friend of mine, Roy Tompkins. He does cartoons for the Austin Chronicle. You probably recognize that style. I think he did it for News of the Weird for a long time, but kind of a nice direct potable reuse. This is me drinking the water at Colorado River Municipal Water District's Big Spring plant. And this is me. Hopefully I was on the right end of the plant drinking that water. I mean, it goes through reverse osmosis, some pretty hardcore ultraviolet, all the different filtrations before it gets there, and it gets that water gets completely cleaned up at this point. I like to joke that it's like, yeah, water's pretty good, slight hint of beef enchiladas, but other than that, but water had no taste. I can't say the water is enjoyable because RO water is not terribly enjoyable. You kind of want to have some minerals in there. And the folks out there are pretty accommodating. This water, it's called a Big Spring plant, but this water goes to all the member cities essentially. And so Midland, Odessa, and others out there. And when the plant first opened up, there were television crews talking to or interviewing some of the locals and saying, hey, do you know where this water's coming from? And they asked this one old boy about it, and they said, what do you think about that? And he says, well, I guess that means I get to drink my beer twice. Now, you might be thinking this will never happen in Central Texas, or we're decades away from that happening in Central Texas, but Murphy Engineering is working with the West Travis County Public Utility Agency to build a direct potable reuse plant. My understanding is they have a permit from TCEQ to do this. The driver here is really more wastewater discharge than water resources, but the water resource component helps to make it more cost effective. This isn't cheap, but in their case, they're trying to avoid, they're growing. They're trying to avoid having to dedicate more land for land application. They can't do a surface discharge. And so if you're completely cleaning this water up, at some point someone goes, well, hell, why don't we just drink it? And so they're considering this. And I think there probably may be more of this coming in the future. So with that policy study out, the Texas American Water Works Association grabbed onto it and talked to Chairman Perry on the Senate Water Committee, and so he's filed Senate Bill 905, and so this is relating to guidance on regulations applicable to potable reuse. He is a co-author with Springer, which is a good sign when the chairman wants to carry the bill, and that has passed the Senate, and then has as of April 14th, I didn't check this morning what the status was, but as April 14th, it was referred to House Natural. And there's also a companion House bill, which is also a good sign because it shows that there's somebody willing to carry that bill on the House side, and a member on House Natural Resource Committee. So kind of watching to see what happens there. The on-site wastewater treatment, you might be like, well, are people really going to do that? And there is greater interest with businesses wanting to do that. And then you're going to hear a little later today about Clara, closed loop advanced reuse assembly that City of Austin has installed at the Permitting and Development Center. So, which will show you kind of how that technology works, which is super cool. In terms of dealing with the kind of the discharge issues there, been working with Texas Water Conservation Association, and working with stakeholders there. Jennifer's been involved in that, as Vanessa has. And working with the Texas Commission of Environmental Quality, it looks like that could be addressed through a rulemaking change. And so those discussions are ongoing. And personally, I feel like the odds of the rules changing to accommodate that look pretty good. And there are, I should name them because I think there's some like client issue stuff, but there are several folks in Central Texas that want to do this on-site wastewater reuse, and at the moment can't because of the discharge requirements. And I just put this up there. It just always makes me happy to see Chris Harrington. He's kind of dreamy, but also just more evidence that TCEQ is willing to work with local folks to change reuse rules and respond to today's reality versus what's happening in the future. So in the end, it's it's okay that we've got regulators in our reuse, particularly if those regulators are reasonable and want to work with us. I do want to a couple more things I want to say. I feel obligated to point out that with One Water, you do want to step back and take a look at the bigger picture. Reuse is, in my opinion, it's a good thing. It's a good strategy. But you do need to step back and look at the environmental issues, because that treated wastewater does go back in the river, which has environmental benefits. And then there's also equity issues in terms of like who's drinking this water, where are these plants, but then also the less water that's put back in the river decreases the resilience of downstream water supplies. So that should be considered also. And then finally, kind of this whole model of doing a attentive policy analysis and putting a report out there for regulators, decision makers, advocates use and take off and get policy change, at least in this case, is working really, really well, I think, because it's providing the background, the options, and it gives people confidence that they can go forward and change things for the good. So with that, I'll take any questions. Unfortunately, I think I ate up most of the time, but there's a minute left.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. Thank you for your presentation. I think that reuse is going to be, I know that reuse is going to be a bigger and bigger part of our water supply picture in the future. Temple put some info in the chat about how to check the 2022 state water plan. It's in draft right now, so folks can go ahead and look in there. There's a little section on that, so on the reuse, so you can look
Cool.
and see how much it's increased. So we do have a question for you. I'm curious to know what the public perception of these potable reuse plants are.
So the plant out in West Texas by the Colorado Municipal Water District, they just did it. I asked John Grant what they did to kind of get the public ready, and he's like, well, about 4 or 5 years before we did it, we just had a few people come by the office and talked about it. So they just did it. But they're fortunate in that one, they don't have a whole lot of water out there, so their constituents recognize that any water that's wet is good water. And then I've also had it pointed out to me that the water out there typically has a total dissolved solids greater than 1,000 on a good day, and a lot of people don't drink that water. They wind up buying water to drink, and so maybe that wasn't a big factor. Up in Wichita Falls, they went through, jumped through a bunch of hoops in a very understanding way with their public to get them comfortable with it. And pretty much what they had to do is just show all the other alternatives were not viable. And then that the only card left on the table was direct potable reuse. And Daniel Nix will tell you that once they stopped the plant, they actually got complaints about the water quality, because when you take DPR water that's been treated with reverse osmosis, it's super fresh. They mix it with their regular supply, which is also tends to be salty, and so the water quality was better. El Paso has amazing support for their direct potable reuse plant. They did a kind of a pre-survey to see where people are at, and it was, I want to say it was somewhere up around 93%. And then after their education, that's gone up to mid to upper 90s in terms of local support. And I think what really helped them is they're a very respected organization in El Paso, very competently run, and are often, the city often goes to them for help on things. And they've also done a very good kind of public outreach and a process of having independent review as they go forward to assure the public that it's safe. But that is a concern that you need to engage your community in a very thoughtful way. And there's some go-bys that you can kind of take a look at.
Great, thank you, Robert. We have one other question in the Q&A, but we'll just go ahead and type the answer in because we need to pass it over to Stacy for the next panel on landscape watering and budgets. And so we will sign off, but keep answering questions in the chat if folks have them.